Welcome to the Art Colony, a podcast about art and art history in Provincetown. My name is Gaston Lacombe. Well, today we have a number of firsts on the Art Colony podcast. It's our first time welcoming a returning guest, and that is Christine McCarthy, Chief Executive Officer at the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Gaston. Thanks for having me
Welcome
back.
back.
Thank you.
And it's also our first time with multiple guests. So let's welcome remotely Elaine Grossman and Daniel Sagalin. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
And we are here today to talk about a new exhibit currently on at the Provincetown Art Association and Museum called Avital Sagalin, Mid-Century Provincetown. And it's on from now until August 2nd, 2026. I always start my podcast by asking my guests who they are. Well, in this case, who is Avital Sagalin is the whole basis of this new exhibit at PAM, right, Chris?
Yes.
So tell us about your reaction finding out about Avital Sagalin.
So at PAM, we have an exhibitions committee that reviews proposals that come in for shows. And typically, a proposal comes in probably 4 to 5 years before the exhibition actually happens. So we sit around a room and we look at images and read about this artist. And the proposal came in, and usually I introduce the proposal. And I said to the committee, "This is Avital Sagalin." And they were like, "Who? Who is that?" And I said, "I don't know, but you need to see these works," because I always look at them in advance to get the presentation ready. And I said, "I have no idea." And we started reading through the information and looking at the slides, and everyone was like, "Wait, who is this? These are wonderful. What size are they? What medium is this?" And it started really like kind of like pinging everybody off of each other as to who this artist was, why we didn't know about her. And yes, we needed to show this artist and the work. And what happens is then 4 years later, you've done 4 years of exhibitions, then all of a sudden it's here and it's upon you, and the crates arrive and the work comes out of the crate. And for me, one of the greatest moments is when work comes out of a crate, because looking at things digitally is a whole different animal. But when you actually see the object in person, these are absolutely breathtaking. Like, they're exquisite and delicate and deep. And, at the time, this artist was in her 20s when she was in Provincetown. And you think, what a mature eye for such a young artist. And those were my initial takeaways, truly. And again, I will sidebar by saying you always hope that the work, when it comes out of the crate, is better than the digitals. And in this case, it absolutely is. And I'm so excited to have this exhibition up, because when you walk into this gallery, these works are floating on the walls, and they're extraordinary. And I'm just so excited about letting the world know who Avital Sagalin is.
Okay, so we found out your reaction to Avital Sagalin, but we still don't know exactly who she was. So you, Daniel and Elaine, have personal experience. Tell us, who was Avital Sagalin?
She was my mother, and she was an artist. I thought growing up she was a great artist, but I didn't really know because I'm not an art professional. But I loved her work growing up, seeing it around the house. And my father encouraged her to work and to draw and to paint, but she never really wanted to exhibit. So many years ago, I decided, well, I'm going to interview her and I'm going to ask her questions about her artwork and what are the stories behind the artwork. This was in 2013, and I asked her stories about, the lobster that was in the dining room, and that's going to be in the exhibition. She told me the story about that. And then a few years later, I decided, well, wouldn't it be great if she had an exhibition? And so she never really pushed herself to be aggressive in exhibiting her work and selling in galleries. And so when I asked her, let's build a website and try to get an exhibition, this is when she was in her 90s, early 90s. This is in 2017, and she agreed to it. So we built her website and then tried to get her an exhibition. And through a connection my mother had at the University of Massachusetts, she was able to get an exhibition at the University of Massachusetts at their main museum in 2019. And it was wonderful. A lot of people came, and most people said, we didn't know your mother was an artist. People who were friends of hers, people who knew her for years and years, but they never knew she was an artist. So she was sort of this artist who, in her early age, was recognized as having great potential by people in the art world, but she didn't want her artwork to be influenced by what would sell. So she kept her artwork to herself.
And where do we find her origins? Where does she come from? Where was she born? What can you tell us about her early years?
Her very, very early years, she was born in Palestine under the British Mandate. 1925, where when she was two, her parents moved to Europe. She grew up in Brussels, and then during World War II, the Nazis bombed Belgium. Their family escaped Europe. They traveled through Europe, going to Portugal, spent many months there waiting for their visas. Then she came to the United States.
And were there any major events in her young life that led her towards being an artist?
Avital was my mother-in-law, so I'm married to Dan, and so I knew Avital for about 33 years during her lifetime. She uh, grew up in this family in her formative years, mostly in Brussels, and the friends of her parents, extended relatives of her parents, lived in St. Petersburg and in Paris. And with that combined with Brussels, Avital was exposed at an early age to lots of incredible European art museums, and her parents were very supportive of this budding artist whose some of whose first words were colors. So she was naming colors like that's red, that's orange, that's green, as some of her first words. So it's almost like she was born to be an artist. But her parents very much encouraged that, and she started her early art education at a very young age, just roaming through museums, really loving that.
And what year did she get to the US?
1941.
So she escaped World War II then.
Yes.
And when she got to the US, she went straight to university or art school or no?
She went to high school.
Mm-hmm.
There in high school, actually, I think it was a Julia Richmond High School. And there, the high school systems of New York and the Museum of Modern Art had a program, art classes for talented students. And each high school could nominate two students to attend the Museum of Modern Art to take classes. My mother was nominated and took classes at the Museum of Modern Art as teenager. And there she also talked about roaming the halls of MoMA, and that was sort of her escape from the trauma that she had just been through, fleeing the war. Um, Also, during high school, her teacher introduced her to Myra Shapiro, who was an art historian. Chris, you can explain more than I can who he was, but they became friends. He was a big advocate of her work and liked her work very much. He wrote her recommendation to get a Fulbright scholarship and later to go to McDowell Colony. Um, so he was also another person who my mother met in the very early years of arriving in New York.
So that was a pretty rapid progression from arriving in 1941 and then being in Provincetown in the art colony in 1945 already. So she was in Provincetown 1945 and 1946, right?
Yes.
So, Chris, what was going on in Provincetown during those years?
That's a time when I definitely would have wanted to been transported back here. Hans Hofmann's school was really at its peak as one of the premier schools for abstract expressionist artists who came to study in Provincetown. Hofmann had a school in New York and in Provincetown, but at that time, his studio was on Nickerson and Commercial Street, where the house is still located today, which is a really, really beautiful space. And in addition to, students coming to study with Hofmann, Myron Stout, who was an incredible artist, who again, I don't know if a lot of people would know Myron Stout, even though I think Myron Stout is like a rock star, and he came to study with Hofmann, and he didn't do a huge body of work, but the work that you see of his is very, very powerful. And Robert Motherwell had just come to Provincetown, and Jackson Pollock was here for a hot minute. He didn't really like it too much because I don't think anyone paid enough attention to him. But Motherwell really, really connected with Provincetown at that time. And Blanche Lizelle was in really the heyday of the white line woodblock print and the work that she was doing in Provincetown. So it was a really exciting time. Artists had come from Europe. They were in Provincetown. They were, communing together. They were making all kinds of different work. Abstraction was really at a height. The traditional painters who were very opposed to abstraction had sort of been over that for about 10 years at this point. But it was a really, really exciting time in Provincetown. And I think for a young artist to come in and be almost like starstruck by what was happening was a possibility. But I think the body of work, more than anything, emphasizes what Avital saw. Like we see who live here, the dunes, seascapes, fishing boats, the piers, things that we see every single day. Her eye was just so acute to the lines and the light and just brought them to a whole different level. Like I guarantee if you ask someone, how old do you think this artist was that did this work, they would, oh, older, very mature. And that's the mind-blowing piece of this, is that she was so young.
She was just in her 20s at that point.
Mhm.
Right. And can I add, she
Sure.
was when she came to Provincetown, it was in 1945 and 1946, and she was a student at Cooper Union.
Right.
After high school, she went to college. She went to Goddard College for 1 year and then transferred to Cooper Union. And she heard about Provincetown being a great place for artists to come. And in fact, she wanted to come here, among other things, because she had friends who recommended it, but she wanted to take a class with Hans Hofmann. And he showed in the story, and my mother told Elaine and me that she went and she met with Hans Hofmann. She showed him her work and said, I'd like to take classes. And he looked at the work and said, you don't need to take classes from me. You already have your own style. You have your own technique. You don't need to learn anything from me. Just go off and keep doing what you're doing.
Which is amazing. That's absolutely amazing. And interestingly, James Gahagan, who was a Hoffman student, he was a professor at Goddard College. So there were connections between Provincetown
Wow.
and Goddard as well. And we did an exhibition of his years ago, but he had a very strong connection to Hoffman. I wonder if there was any connection between the
Huh.
two of them. Who knew?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Did
Wow.
she have any interesting stories she told you about her time in Provincetown?
I think she had a couple of interesting stories. One was just her fascination and artistically and personally with the Portuguese American fishermen
Yes.
families in Provincetown. It She said that it reminded her of the warm welcome that she and her family received in Lisbon when they spent 6 or 7 months there in the final part of their journey across Western Europe as they were awaiting their visas to come to the United States after Belgium came under Nazi attack. Um, that was a really special thing to feel welcomed at that point after the traumas that she and her family had endured. Um, so when she found that Provincetown was filled with these similarly very warm families, that was something that she recalled years and years later. The other really notable thing that happened with her in Provincetown in terms of meeting people was that she met Reuben Tam here in Provincetown, who was a Hawaiian native, uh, came to Provincetown, fell in love with Provincetown, and fell in love with Boothbay Harbor and Monhegan Island in Maine. Um, he was, I want to say, about 20 years Avital senior, um, became a good friend despite the age difference, platonic friends, and she cited him often as an influence on her work.
I think also for me, when I was looking at the show yesterday, a lot of times when I don't know who an artist is well, I like to watch a video if I can and listen to their voice and what they look like and listen. And I was watching a little video yesterday where Avital talks about this painting that she did, and it's yellow, and she talks about it. I mean, the simplicity is just it's a complexity of simplicity. I don't know how else to say it. She said, "I was looking, and I saw this sun, I saw this yellow, and this is what I made." And this painting, it's one of the stars of the exhibition. But when you hear her talk about it, and then you look at it, and then you listen again and look back, it just makes so much sense. And I that's always been such a helpful tool because we do show a lot of artists at PAM who people have never heard of. A body of work's been, buried in an attic for decades and it comes out. Who are these artists? And for me, as a curator, one thing I've always found very useful is, yeah, to read about them, but to listen to them. And when you hear her voice and see her, she was a beautiful woman and just so natural and listening, I could listen to her all day. That's what I really, really like the sound of her voice. And she's so confident in when she speaks about the art, especially the Provincetown period. And it's just really reinforcing to the entire exhibition.
Welcome back. Just a reminder to follow us on Instagram at the Art Colony Podcast. And also, if you want to help us out, you can do so by going to buymeacoffee.com, do a search for the Art Colony Podcast, and you can leave us a tip to help us stay on air. Thank you to all of those who have helped us up to now. Now, Chris, why is it important for us right now to mark Avital's passage in Provincetown?
Well, I think for people who go to museums, they expect to see blockbusters and they want to see artists that they know, and blockbusters draw artists in. And I think one of the beautiful parts of PAM is we don't do that. We do it every few years, but it's not the way we roll. The way we roll is to introduce artists that have contributed to the art colony by being influenced from what it offers. And we talk about what an inspiration Provincetown is, whether it's the landscape or the light. And when people say, "Why do you come? What is it about the light in Provincetown?" And my answer is, you need to come and see it for yourself, and then you'll understand. And so when I look at a new body of work, one of the things I look for is what inspired this artist through the beauty of this spit of land. And that's what you get when you look at Avital's work. And I think that when people walk into this exhibition, they're going to be surprised by the quiet elegance of this work. And then when you really start on inspection, the power of the line and a fishing boat or a pier, the things that we look at every single day, you're looking at them in a new light. And I can't tell you, for 25 years, I've been looking at sunsets, sailboats, landscapes, piers, but this body of work has energized me again and has really confirmed how lucky I am that I live here, looking at a body of work that was created in 1945 and 1946.
Well, that's wonderful. I can't wait to see it. And now I'm worried because I do boats and sunsets and piers.
Well, yours are very different too.
Okay, thank you. Now, Daniel and Elaine, after Provincetown, Avital had a few extremely exciting years. Can you tell us a bit more about her youth at that time? There was a Fulbright. There was meeting with Picasso. Tell us more about that.
In 1949, Avital was really fortunate to be one of the first female recipients of a Fulbright scholarship. And it was to go to the Fulbright scholarship was to go to Paris and study painting at the École des Beaux-Arts. And Gaston, you could please tell me the correct pronunciation of that.
École des Beaux-Arts.
Merci beaucoup. It was, and may still be, an extremely legendary school of painters going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Avital took a few days of classes there and then decided this was not for her. It was a kind of instruction where they copied the great masters, which is actually very helpful for artists, but she had already done that at Cooper Union. And I think made a very good decision that these classes are not going to help me. I'm going to just become a working artist here in Paris. And that's really where the adventure began. She met a lot of fellow artists, many her age, many older than her. These included household names like Picasso, Brancusi, and other names of people who went on to become well known in the museums across Europe and the United States. And she was one of the only female artists at that time painting in this circle. But she felt extremely liberated by it. She felt respected in this community of painters. That said, she was told a number of times, you're incredible for a woman painter. You should continue painting like a man, is actually what the painter Edouard Pignon told her. She took it for the compliment that it was intended to be. But that's the milieu in which she was painting at that time. But she painted an incredible series of paintings during her multiple years that she was in Paris, only one of which was under the Fulbright, but sort of bookended from about 1948 to 1951. She was in Paris and did an incredible series of paintings from her rented apartment, which was in the fashion district. And it was of mannequins that were populating her rented apartment because it had previously been used or was in between use as a fashion designer's workshop, and it had many three-way mirrors. And so she felt like she was amongst many human forms that were duplicated hundreds of times in the three-way mirrors. And it was an incredible inspiration for a series of paintings that she did on canvas.
On the website you created for her, there's an Avital Sagalin website. There's a page with a lot of videos that you recorded with her while she was still alive, and she's telling stories. She has these fascinating stories about Picasso, and Picasso was aware of her work, and he was excited to meet her. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So my mother, this is during her Fulbright years when she was in Paris around 1950, and a friend of hers said, we should go to Picasso's gallery and meet him. And my mother said, "Oh, I don't want to meet him. I don't want to be one of these people who are chasing after famous people. I can know him through his work. I don't want to go." And he said, "Well, let's just go to the gallery and we can see the work there. And you don't have to do anything. We'll just go and we'll look at the gallery." So my mother said, "Well, okay, we'll go to the gallery." So she went to the gallery and out comes Picasso. She didn't expect to see him. I guess the friend who had arranged it might have known. And he goes, "Avital, Avital." So obviously he knew who she was. And she said, "Picasso?" And then he put her, my mother pinched, she tells the story that she pinched him because she couldn't believe it was really him. And he said, "I can do better than that." And he gave her a big hug. And he said, "You ought to come visit me at my studio, and you ought to come to Valoris in the south of France, where he has a ceramic workshop." So my mother said, "Thank you very much. Yes, we'll definitely do that. Thank you so much." So that was the first meeting. A few weeks later, this friend called again and said, "Okay, I'm going to go see Picasso at his studio building. You should come." And my mother said, "No, again, I told you, I don't want to go and be kind of one of these hanger-ons, chasing after fame." He said, "Oh, come on. I'm going with a couple other people and you should go." And my mother said, "Well, okay, if other people are going, then it's not so bad. I'll just be one among a few people. I can go." So my mother went, and she immediately recognized the woman who opened the door because my mother said Picasso during the war had painted his concierge um, with three eyes. My mother said, "This woman, I recognized her because she looked like she had three eyes." They then went upstairs into like a waiting room. My mother tells a story that she felt very uncomfortable and that the room was really messy and that there were canvases upside down with the paint side down, which is what you're never supposed to do. There was an ashtray filled with cigarette butts. So they waited and they waited. And then all of a sudden, doors open and in comes Picasso with, his entourage. And he said, "Oh, Avital, where's your work? Where's your work?" And he said, my mother said, "Well, I didn't bring my work." But one of the women my mother was with, who was on that little trip, said, "Well, I did." And she showed him her work. Um, and then many months later, she went to the south of France and visited him in a ceramic workshop. And she tells the story about how um, she remembers very distinctly what she was wearing. It was a dress with square straps and straight across. And he looked at her and he said, "I know what I'm going to paint next." My mother said, "Yes, what is that?" And he said, the woman, what is it? The woman of
The woman of Algiers.
the women of Algiers.
Yeah.
And my mother said, "What's that?" He explained to her. I guess she was not familiar with that series of work, and he explained to her what that series of work was going to be. And I guess the way my mother was sitting, the way she was dressed, that reminded him as if she were a character in The Women of Algiers. Um, my mother talked about how um, at Valoris there was the goat. There's a metal or cast iron sculpture of a goat that I don't know if there's many, if there's just one at the Museum of Modern Art. But my mother remembers seeing that goat that's now at the Museum of Modern Art
At Valoris.
at Valoris,
Just sitting out.
just sitting out.
So cool.
It's interesting how she crossed paths with a lot of very interesting people. She talks about Picasso, Brancusi. She was staying in Marc Chagall's house in southern France. She was close friends with Dizzy Gillespie. I'm just thinking, were there fewer people on Earth back then? How
I
did
know.
this happen? But there's one story that's actually interesting for Provincetown, because she had a run-in with one of Provincetown's native sons, Admiral Macmillan. We have here in town the Macmillan Pier. Can you tell us more about that story of her and Admiral Macmillan?
So this is I captured in the video that I produced, and and for this video, I also interviewed the woman that my mother was with. So I heard the story from my mother, and I heard it from the person who was with her. So my mother tells the story that she went to Maine to draw and to paint, and I think she was inspired by
Reuben Tam and Carl Nestjar were
Ruben
there.
Tam and Carl Nestjar. Carl Nestjar, he he was also a Fulbright scholar, and he ended up being the the man who actually built many of Picasso's big sculptures.
Sculpture fabricator.
Sculpture
okay.
fabricator. He worked with Picasso, but at the time, I don't know if he did that at the time. My
I don't
mother
think
went
so.
to Maine. Anyway, my mother went to Maine to draw and to paint
And to be with these
and to
friends.
be with friends. And in the town, the bells were ringing, and my mother said, "What's going on here?" And people in town said, "Well, Admiral Macmillan is on his boat, and he's about to go off to the North Pole or to the Arctic with students from the University of Chicago." And my mother said, "Oh, I would love to go to the North Pole." And she said, "I would love to go to the North Pole just to see the horizon with just one tree," which is kind of odd because, I'm sure there aren't any trees in the North Pole, but that's what my mother said. So my mother went down to the dock and went up to Admiral Macmillan and said, "I hear you're going to the North Pole. I'd like to come." And he said, "Well, no women on the boat. Sorry." And she said, "Well, I can work for you. I will scrub the deck. I'll wash the dishes. I can do anything you want. I can do it." Said, "Sorry, you can't do it. No women on the deck." My mother pointed to a woman on the deck and said, "Well, I see you have a woman over there." He said, "Well, that's my wife." So my mother tells the story. Well, she can't remember what happened next, but the friend who went with her, who I interviewed for the story, Ida Megan, um, Ida says that my mother showed Admiral Macmillan drawings and sketches and said, if you give me a ride, I will do sketches of the men in your trip, in your expedition. So my mother showed him the work, and the wife and the captain looked at it and said, "This is really good. Okay, you can come with us." So they get on the boat and they start going. And within half an hour, my mother started feeling seasick. And um, my mother said, "I felt really sick, but I couldn't really say, 'Could you drop us off?' After having begged to get a ride." But as they're going up and down in the waves and in the water, my mother sees this land and said, "What is that?" And "What is that land?" And the Captain Macmillan or someone on the crew said, "That's Monhegan Island." And my mother had heard that Monhegan Island is supposed to be a beautiful place and artists go there. So my mother said, "Oh, well, could you drop us off there?" Now, Ida, the friend of my mother's, tells the story that they got in the boat and the sailors were really crude and very vulgar, making fun of women and their bodies. And they felt really uncomfortable. And Ida tells the story that when my mother began to tell the crew and started to feel sick, Ida thought it was a blessing because they knew they could use that as an excuse to get off without offending the crew. So when they got to Mohegan Island, because they didn't had not planned to take a detour and to spend a month on Mohegan Island, they didn't have any money, so they ate um, beans from cans for a month on Mohegan Island.
It's interesting that at a young age, she was extremely adventurous.
It was.
Even I
It
don't think I
was.
would go up to a boat and say, "Hey, take me to the North Pole."
Well, I'm happy to say that Avital will be reunited with Admiral Macmillan because his house is directly across the street from Pam. And we also
Yes.
do have a fabulous portrait of him by Garrett Beneker in our collection. So they're back together again, not at the North Pole, but in Provincetown.
Right. And I just will add, the drawings my mother did of Maine are really wonderful.
Of Monhegan Island
Monhegan
in
Island.
particular. So that was another gift in a way
Yeah.
that she was dropped off at Monhegan Island because the works that she did there were fabulous. That's what she spent the month doing. And her friend was an actress and dancer, and she was actually preparing lines to appear in a play the following month. So they had a wonderful time on this beautiful island.
So Daniel and Elaine, one fact that's very interesting about Avital is that even though she was an accomplished artist with obvious talent, she really did not show her work during her lifetime. Why was that?
I think Avital was a very complex person. And early on in the 1940s, 1950s, she was approached by gallery owners in New York and in Paris, actually leading galleries in those two cities, with interest in exhibiting her work as such a young woman. And she felt at that time she wasn't ready. She felt that she wasn't sure if she was interested in a life of working while having to sell her work. She felt that that was perhaps going to inhibit her inspiration. And so that was a huge factor in her saying no to those exhibitions at that time. And then in the mid 1950s, she met the love of her life, Dan's father, and they got married, raised a family. And I think at that point, her focus became a little bit different. She continued to be a lifelong artist for as long as Dan knew her from birth and as long as I knew her. She was always sketching and painting. So she found time, she made time, particularly during travel, to be inspired by art and to create art. But she had a sense of what I think of as reserve and humility about her art. I think she was in private rightfully proud that she was an accomplished artist, but she was really doing it for herself and didn't feel so comfortable putting it out there in the world until late in life.
Did she have a professional life also that was linked with the arts, or was that something that was completely private and at home?
When she came back from her Fulbright in Paris, she went to the Museum of Modern Art and worked there and taught art to children. And she did that in the 50s and 60s. So when I was born in the early 60s, and while we were in New York, she worked there, and in the mid to late 50s, she worked there teaching art. And then we moved to Amherst, Massachusetts, and my mother was on the acquisitions committee of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst's gallery or museum, and she was on the committee to hire their first director. And in fact, the curator of the show at PAM, Betsy Searsma, wonderful woman, she worked at UMass at the time and knew my mother from then, and um, interacted all the time with the acquisition committee. And
And
that,
you
and
you
that
have videos also on your website where one of her colleagues, his name was Hugh, I forget,
Hugh
Hugh
Davies.
Hugh Davies. He
Hugh
said he
Davies.
had worked with her for something like 30 years and never even knew that she was an artist.
And Betsy told me yesterday when we were walking through the show that Avital was on the acquisitions committee and she didn't know she was an artist. She said, I knew her for so long and I didn't know she was an artist. She said, I knew she knew a lot about art, but she never said she was an artist. And I was like, isn't that just amazing?
Yeah. So what is it that at the end of her life made her change her life and say, okay, now I'm ready to show it?
At 90 years old.
I kind of encouraged her to build a website and to share her work and to try to get an exhibition. And she was a little bit reluctant, but her friends and family were also encouraging her to do that. Um, and so it was a process. I took photographs of her work and we put it online, but she wanted it password protected. She didn't want anyone to see. Um, and we spent a lot of time going through the work that I had posted and writing the captions and taking things down. She said that's not good enough, but this is very strong. I only want to put my best work. She was a very good editor, and we continued. I continued learning the stories about the work and when she did them. Um, and for a long time, she insisted on having it password protected. And even when we finally went to the University of Massachusetts to see if they'd be interested in an exhibit, Loretta Yardlow, the museum director, couldn't get access to the website because she couldn't figure out how to put in the password. So finally said, okay, I am taking down that password. I don't care if anyone does. We built this website so people can see it. I'm taking it down. And then Loretta could see it and said, oh my God, this is great. Yes, we'll have an exhibition. That was part of the process. You see it a little bit differently, or you've got a different, how did it came together?
Just only no, I fully support what Dan said, and I could only add a couple of things. And that is one thing that really triggered this whole conversation about having an exhibition is that for years and years, decades, Avital had stored her early works of art in the house in boxes that I think Dan and his siblings knew vaguely might have been there, but it just never really came up. Again, I think it was part of Avital's humility of not really talking about, she had anecdotes on occasion about Picasso and Brancusi, etc., but didn't really talk about um, the the quality, the high quality of artworks that she had just stored away and had not become part of the dozen or so artworks that she and her husband had framed and put on the family home walls. Um, as part of the interviews that Dan did with his mom beginning in 2013 and continuing for several years, it took until what, about 2016 or 2017 until Dan started opening up these boxes and saying, "What's in here from your early years as an art student, etc." And was shocked at what he was finding. This was with Avital's support. She was curious too about what was in those boxes. I think she had forgotten about a lot of the pieces. And I think she may not have realized herself the high quality of the works that she had stored away. So it was all these sort of factors coming together. But the real trigger for it, I think, was the discovery of how much work she had done. It was just loose, often paper, some canvases, but a lot of loose paper just in boxes stored away, sketchbooks stored away, and not looked at for some 70 years or so. Um, that was an incredible sort of revelation.
And I just wanted to ask Christine, how do you approach curating an exhibit when you have an artist who has so little information? Like there's not there aren't previous exhibits, there are not books published. How do you approach then creating an exhibit around that?
You have a good curator like Betsy,
Hmm.
who selected the work for this exhibition. But what's really nice about the show is that it does include some of the sketches that have been, taken out of the sketchbook because they still have the perforations on the edge, which I love. And it was really her eye. She picked the work, and when it gets to us, we really allow the curator to do their thing. We do not interfere. We let you. Here's the space, you go. And that's one of the great things about having a guest curator program is that not all the exhibitions look the same. I mean, I curate in a certain style. Betsy and my style is actually very similar, which I was very happy about. The show is not overcrowded. It's spaced beautifully, gives a lot of time for a viewer to really interact with a grouping or a single work, which I think is really great. And there's actually is a big whalebone in the exhibition that coincides with a couple of the sketches, which are really neat. But I mean, for me, like I said, we were floored by the body of work when we looked at it in the proposal. But we didn't even, I mean, after we looked at it, then we read but it was the body of work that hit all of us really, really hard. And I think to me, that's the sign of something that's worthy of being shown without even knowing anything about it.
So the exhibit is on at PAM from now until August 2nd. So let's tell our listeners, if they go see the exhibit, how would you suggest they approach it? How would you suggest they, go into a room when they see an artist they don't know yet?
Well, luckily there is a video monitor in the exhibition as well that has the interview with Avital, and there is wall text. Sometimes people like to look at the website first and read about the artist beforehand, or people want to go in and then learn about the artist after. I think it's really your own, what really works for you. I would say that when you go into the museum, it's in our Duffy Gallery. So if you go into the entrance of the museum, make a left into the patrons gallery, and then go into the Duffy Gallery from that way. There's 3 ways you can go into that gallery, but I would say start from the front of the museum and go back, and that way you really get to experience that yellow painting that I was talking about earlier, because it's breathtaking and it's on a wall by itself, and I think it's just absolutely beautiful.
And Daniel and Elaine, what should our listeners and viewers know to better appreciate the history. So they're going to go to the exhibit, but what should they have in their mind before they get there about Avital, her life, her work?
Well, I think one of the things that Avital used to say quite a bit comes to my mind, and that was the work speaks for itself. She really believed that when she did share her art, that it's really up to a viewer. It's in a viewer's hands to um, either resonate with it, to really understand it, or interpret it in a way that's meaningful to them, or to walk past it if it doesn't. And she didn't like, as part of her reserve, her sense of reserve, I think she didn't like to tell people about her art that much, but also didn't like to tell people what to think about her art. So I would encourage people to go in with just an open mind and an open heart, and see the work. One additional thing I would just add is just the that I think is surprising about both her entire body of works and Betsy's beautiful curation. And that is that there's such a diversity of style and emotion across the works that are exhibited and in her lifetime. She used elements of abstract expressionism, cubism, representational art, and more than I'm even familiar with, not being an art historian myself.
Now, you told me that in the exhibit, there's the work from Provincetown, but there's also a sampling of works from other periods. Can you tell us more about that?
Um, so there are several works that, with Chris's encouragement, Betsy curated from different periods in Avital's life to illustrate for visitors ways in which Avital took some of the same themes or some of the same techniques that she had used in Provincetown and evolved with them over time. So some of the works that Betsy curated include some from Boothbay Harbor, Maine, which was just a year or two after her experience in Provincetown, and then several through the decades, all the way up to the 1970s, when she spent quite a bit of time in Casey Key, Florida. And being a seashore, there are a lot of themes that you can see that really relate artistically and thematically to the main part of the exhibition, which is Provincetown related.
And Chris, why is it important right now for us to see this work in Provincetown?
Well, I'm going to ask you that question after you see the exhibition.
Okay.
No, I like I said earlier, I think it's really important and part of our mission for us to showcase artists that were inspired and are part of the art colony and have added to the legacy of Provincetown and Pam. And I think an artist that, like Avital, again, will stick with you and you won't forget her. And I think that's really important.
I really can't wait to go see it.
Yeah.
Now, before I let everybody go, Daniel and Elaine, let us know about the website.
No, it's avitalsagalin.com.
Could
So
you spell that just to be sure?
AvitalSagalyn.com. Avitalsagalin.com.
And there you can see pretty much all of her body of work. And then also this fantastic page with all these videos where you can hear Avital talking about her life, her stories, her meeting Picasso, her hanging out with Admiral Macmillan, and all these wonderful things we already talked about. You also have an Instagram page, right?
We do. And so we post to that about once a week. We've been focusing for the last 6 months or so on posting pieces that Betsy curated for this exhibition. And so you can get a little bit of a preview looking at the most recent postings on at Avital Sagalin on Instagram.
Great. And PAM, of course, is PAAM.org.
Yes, it is.
You can go to the PAM website to find out more information about the exhibit specifically. Are there going to be lectures or any activities around this?
Yes. Well, the public opening is not till the 26th of June. So the show will open tomorrow for people to come in and see it. But the actual public opening is on the 26th of June.
One thing I would love to bring up is something that, Chris, you may want to tell our listeners about, which is the Outer Cape Chamber Orchestra.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes. So last year we teamed up with the Outer Cape Chamber Orchestra Group, and we created this program where Joseph Gottoff, who is the cellist and leader of this group of mostly strings, he chooses one artwork from one of the exhibitions and he creates a whole entire program around the artwork. And so we are doing that with Avital's exhibition. I don't know what the artwork is yet. We talk about it afterward. He hasn't told me which one he's choosing yet. But that will be, there are four concerts. It starts on June 21st, and then it's the Monday. No, it's the Sunday, I think the Tuesday, and then the following week, the Tuesday, the Thursday. It's within the last week of June and the first week of July. But we'll do 4 of those concerts, and one of them will focus on Avital's work. So that should be really exciting.
And that's available on the PAM webpage?
Yes, it is.
PAM.org. Well, great. We've reached the end of our time here, and I just can't wait to run to the museum to go see the show now. And I hope our listeners will be doing the same. So thank you very much, Christine McCarthy, Elaine Grossman, and Daniel Sagalin for our first show with multiple guests.
Yeah. Thank you, Gaston.
And
Thank you for having us.
thank you to all our listeners, and have a great day.